So I wanted to welcome everybody to our event tonight. It's the fourth in the series that we're doing, and tonight we're focusing on positioning your research for a commercial partner. My name's Roger Kitterman. I'm the Vice President of Venture here at Partners Healthcare, Partners Innovation. And I'll introduce the panel in a minute, but I just want to spend 30 seconds talking about, what do we mean when we say commercial partners and what is the relationship there? Because people usually think about dollars. And it's usually about is there research funding, are there royalties, those kinds of things. That's how people think about commercialization. And those things are important, but this is really about the mission. Because how does the science get translated into a product that's going to help a patient? This is how it happens. And so, very excited to have a couple of great panels tonight. The first one will be focused on the industry perspective, and then the second much more on the investigator perspective on the topic. So I'll start by introducing Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller's been with us just about a year now, and he'll be moderating the first panel. Glenn comes to us after a long background in industry with stops at AstraZeneca, and then before that, a lot of experience with Genzyme in their diagnostics division. So Glenn will introduce the rest of his panel. So,
a great panel this evening to really talk about the industry side of how they view interactions with academic medical centers and academia overall. And I thought the best way to do this would be to start by introducing folks, let them describe what their role is in their company, which you'll see varies a little bit by company, which I think is an important thing to remember as you think about dealing with industry and who you're interacting with. So first, immediately to my left is Anthony Bannon from AbbVie.
Good evening. As Glenn said, my name is Tony Bannon. I am actually, you'll hear again different, I am actually embedded in our neuroscience discovery organization. So I wear a few hats, but one of the hats that I wear is helping us identify external collaborations that fit in our strategy. So we're very focused, if you will, about what we're looking for. So we have our own internal strategy, and so I kind of, part of my role has been to go out and find the kind of things that work for us. So I have a PhD in pharmacology. I still run drug discovery projects as well, so that's another hat I wear. So that's my story.
And to Tony's left is Nader Halim from Pfizer.
Great, thanks, Nader Halim. And I work for Pfizer's External Science and Innovation Group. So we're a group of science-trained and business-trained folks who sit within worldwide research and development. We look to find opportunities in the external environment that can augment our internal R&D capabilities. So in my particular role, I focus predominantly on academic institutions. I'm geographically based and therapeutic area agnostic. So I search for opportunities basically New York South, though I'm temporarily covering the entire eastern seaboard as we're down a person. But I look for opportunities across all stages of development, across all therapeutic areas that are a strategic fit for Pfizer.
And last but not least, we have Sridhar Nadazan from Sanofi.
Sridhar Nadazan. I've been with Sanofi for 24 years now, all the time in Boston. I had many roles in Sanofi, started as a scientist, and then I was the scientific site head for Sanofi. That was before Genzyme acquisition in 2010, I believe. And now my current role is as the head of strategic initiatives. In our R&D, we had multiple strategic initiatives that responsible for making investments in areas that will have long-term impact on our R&D process. So one of the things naturally is investing in academia, identifying emerging scientific opportunities and investing in them. And one of the things we did, which MGH is part of, is the so-called iAward program. There are about 10 universities in the US. We just launched this program in Europe just last month with another 10 universities. So we have, between Europe and the US, about 20 universities working together to bring some ideas to our R&D leadership to decide on some investments. And we do invest in the U.S. through this program about 20 projects, 20 to 30, so which we'll talk a little bit more. So that's one of the examples of strategic initiatives my group does.
Actually, Sridhar, I'll stay with you for a moment because you raise an interesting point that we often see in dealing with industry is the difference between the competitive kind of request for proposal method versus knowing someone in a particular business unit that you think might be interested in your work and forming that relationship through networking. How do you find there are differences between those two, and do you have preferences for them, or what works best for Sanofi?
Well, I put together this program, so I have certain bias. I think one of the big challenges for people sitting in this room or in any university is finding the right person in pharma to pitch their story to. It's often difficult for young investigators to know somebody in a pharmaceutical company. And even if they know them, it's pretty hard to reach them because we all do multiple things, as you know. So this kind of program really bypasses that, right? So we hear Sanofi will send a call for proposal with area of interest. We'll provide a little bit more details in this call for proposal. So anyone has any great idea can just submit to us. And we asked one person from, a scientist from each university to be part of this selection committee to remove certain industry bias. So it's a joint process by which we select these projects. And once we identify projects to fund, then we really work together, right? So this is one way to get to know of each other. And for us, it's really an easy process rather than sending our scouts all the time looking for opportunities. We still do that, but this is another easier way, I think, to gain access to a lot of great ideas.
So, Nader, can you give us a sense about how many project Pfizer might see, a request for projects, that sort of thing, versus how many they're actually funded?
Yeah, so we see in the hundreds to thousands. So I probably within my territory see several hundred proposals per year or more. The number that we fund, that's actually a little bit of a difficult question because the number of proposals that we receive that are on strategy in an area where we're looking for programs, even if we do say these are strategic areas of interest, we often receive proposals that are peripheral to those areas of interest. There may be internal programs on those targets that we wouldn't pursue external opportunities, or they may be just off the mark for what we're soliciting. So, it depends on how granular I think we as industry are in saying what we're actually looking for. And then how well of a match there is externally. So, I think the answer is the uptake is relatively low, but that's not just because we turn down every proposal. When we cull down to those proposals that are on strategy, it's probably a little bit higher funding rate. Also, we have multiple different vehicles. So I work for a group that's agnostic to funding. So we have multiple different funding vehicles. We have the Centers for Therapeutic Innovation that we partner with partners on. We have sponsored research agreements. We have seed funding. We have a venture arm. So I look for opportunities across the spectrum. So it's a little bit hard to give that answer. But in general, what we're looking for and the proposals that we received, we fund obviously much fewer than what we see.
And it sounds like if you're agnostic to funding, you're also a little bit broader in what budget you're pulling from for the funding on that.
Absolutely, and I think that speaks to being kind of creative in working with the principal investigator or with the research group. So oftentimes, folks will see something or have an idea that they're presenting in a particular therapeutic area that they think this may be a fit. But if the collaborator is willing to be kind of have an open-ended discussion, maybe we can think about retooling that. So oftentimes we may go in thinking this is a program for X vehicle, but as we have a discussion, we think about a different therapeutic area and a different vehicle. So, having that flexibility, I think, serves both sides as well.
And Tony, what makes a really good proposal that hits that level that it's not being called out, it starts to get farther down the funnel?
I think precision, so just concise and to the point. As you can imagine, we do see a lot of things, but one, don't forget the simple things too, typos and those kind of things. I mean, it matters, and especially face to face. If you get an opportunity to present something to an industry partner, spend the right amount of time. Have some people look at how you present and the things you're doing. You'd be surprised, I mean, about how you can get turned off of something when somebody as simple as just typos or something like that, because you're starting to think, well, is that how they do their science? But from a proposal standpoint, for us, I think, again, it's concise, and one of the things you're going to hear over and over and over if you start dealing with the industry guys is milestones, right? Show me something. We want a go, no-go decision. We want to be the ability to kind of be able to either change direction or even, frankly, stop if something's not working out. So when you think about your research and, you know, a series of a proposal, if you will, you want to have really clean, concise milestones.
And when you're thinking about getting into a project and looking at those milestones, and now you've selected a project to work on, and the milestone is not hit for a particular reason that everyone understands, but there's still value to the remainder of the project. Is that something that, no, you're done, come back and reapply, or do you work with the investigator and go forward?
Our experience so far, and this is for you as well, is I would say 90% of the proposals that we're doing, usually we have to change direction in some manner. And so the PIs that we really enjoy working with are ones that are open to changing direction, because science changes, time changes science, as you know. And I mean, we've been in the middle of proposals where we literally have our collaborations where we literally have changed literal direction.
Mm-hmm.
But the PI is willing to do that because, one, it makes sense, and that's where the science has taken us. So we rarely, frankly, have just stopped. There's a lot of reasons to that. We do a lot of just single investigator proposals just because of the nature of what we're after. And usually those are 2 years or something like that. So to stop that in 2 years, usually you don't even have the science. So there's a reality of probably not being able to stop, frankly, because there are technical reasons for that. There'll be contractual, whatever, stop fees and all that. So usually you'll finish it, but I think the what you have to keep in mind is that it's not set in stone, at least in our experience.
And actually, this, I think, is a question for both in the function that you described for both Pfizer and Sanofi, and in the sense of, as you look for opportunities within your geographic district, is a project that is, as they say in other areas, shovel-ready, that you're ready to start now, as opposed to, I've got the money, now I'm going to spend the next 6 months getting ready to begin. Is that more attractive to you that you can get going now, or is it more like an award situation where there's a proposal period, there's a review period, and it's already long? How does that work between both of your organizations?
Well, the reason we fund academic projects is we want to put something in our pipeline down the road, right? Mm-hmm. This is not a NIH exercise. I think, when we engage in academic research, we want to put something in our pipeline, early stage pipeline, within 2-3 year time frame, right? Then it takes another 3-4 years to get to the clinic, So it has to be somewhat shovel ready. It cannot be basic research. It cannot be a 5-year research, which will put something after that time frame. Because in the industry, a lot of things changes, right? In our company, we go through change every couple of years for one reason or other. So we had to take all of those things, practical things, into consideration. So we tend to select projects where there is either an early stage molecule or means to get to an early stage molecule within a 2-3 year time frame. That is the basis for our funding.
And Nader, how does that relate to how you pick a project and move it forward?
Yeah, and again, it depends on the vehicle. So if there's an interesting mechanism of action that we're interested in study that may have therapeutics down the road in multiple different therapeutic areas, say autophagy or immunometabolism, that may be a sponsored research agreement that it may be a little bit more open-ended, a little bit more of, hey, let's do the science with an expert in the field externally. We're not necessarily looking for a drug target immediately. We're kind of de-risking and evaluating a particular mechanism of action that we know is a much longer-term play. There are other times when folks in an academic institution have what they think is a hit or a lead. And oftentimes there's a little bit of a different standard, frankly, between industry and academia. And when we think, what is a tool compound, what's a therapeutic compound, and where we're ready to go. So I think being open-ended and, industry does science, drug development is a science in and of itself, right, as well as the science of the particular area. So, a lot of folks in academia, and when I came from academia, didn't have any experience with what drug development is. And I think giving a little bit of time and kind of trusting your partner and finding the right partner for you is important. And what you think is shovel-ready may not be shovel-ready. That may be just a tool compound that we need to go back and rethink about re-engineering an antibody or doing another screen on. So it's a difficult, actually, question to answer.
And Sridhar, with the way that Sanofi structures their things, when you work your way through something you want to fund, you said that the goal is to get something in your pipeline. So really, what are the other expectations, I guess, is what I'm asking, for the program you have out there and why you're doing this in the first place?
Well, with any academic collaboration, I think the long-term relationship aspect is equally very important. Any investigator might be doing something today that may or may not be attractive to our eyes today, but you may find something next year or a year after or many years after, which we would like you to come to us, right? So I personally place a lot of importance and spend a lot of time in walking around all these places here in Boston, building that relationship, whether or not sometimes we don't even fund the research in that lab, but we continue to see them, talk to them, so that we are aware of what's going on. So that's an important aspect besides just simple funding and trying to put something in our pipeline. Again, coming back to that theme of putting something in our pipeline, I look at the actual numbers of the program I described, the iAward program. So we fund, when we call for proposal in the US, we get somewhere between 300, 400 proposals sent to us. And then we trim it down to 50, 60 number and fund about 25 to 30 max. And we work really very, very close with the investigators as much as we can. It varies between investigators, how engaged they want to be. But I can see about, 25%, 30% conversion into what we will consider as a very, very early stage molecule. It still won't be a lead molecule within the company. It'll be 2-3 years away from lead molecule. But at least it has a very interesting science behind it, something novel that we couldn't do within the company. As big as we are, we don't have most of the expertise needed in the early stage research space, right? So these kind of partnerships and fill that void, and it's very important to us.
So we have 3 companies, and 2 out of the 3 individuals we have here are a bit more global and agnostic in their approach. But Tony, you're a bit more focused in neuro. So what makes a really good collaboration in your space that's much more focused?
Well, for us,
As you can imagine, the ones that are working really well currently, and again, one of my roles is I help kind of manage and take the top level, if I can handle it, the science piece, and then I'll go internally to the more experts to deal with things. But the ones that are working well are literally the collaborations where AbbVie is bringing something to the table and the collaborators bring something to the table. So that may be a technology or equipment that we have that will facilitate, our both of us getting where we want to go. I will say that for the neuroscience piece for us right now, a lot of our collaborations are on the basic science because we're trying to learn, we're trying to teach ourselves, we feel like we have not done a good job in understanding the basic science of a lot of the things we've worked on, and we feel like doing that will make us a better drug hunter in the end. So we are investing in a lot of kind of basic science proposals, but of course it's targeted because it's things that we've decided we believe are of interest. But again, the short answer of that is when it's true collaborations and not when we're just, asking an investigator just to run a single experiment or whatever that be.
So, Nader, when you're looking in the East Coast and you've identified someone that you think has a project that's really worthwhile for Pfizer, how is that engagement put together if you have someone at Pfizer on the West Coast who is the expert that ought to be in that collaborative event that Tony just described? How does that work within Pfizer, and how important is that?
Yeah, we work. So while I'm geographically focused, our internal network is global within Pfizer, and we pull the appropriate resources wherever they are. So, our oncology groups are primarily located in La Jolla. The biologics division is in San Francisco. We have another group up in Pearl River. So if it's a small molecule project that I need to leverage our folks in La Jolla, it's really easy to pull them in. We have regular meetings with them. So leveraging our internal expertise is something that we do all the time. And that's really, I think, one of the functions of our jobs as well, is not just our network in the external environment, but our network in the internal environment, and being able to leverage, the right folks on both sides of our Pfizer walls to be able to think about putting a project together. So internally, that's actually not an issue. It's quite easy to leverage resources that we have. We tend to be focused in hubs within Pfizer and most other pharmaceutical companies. So we know where those people are. We know are the people who are kind of receptive to external engagements and folks who want to engage in the external community. So it's pretty easy to build that internal team.
So, Sridhar, you described that the iAward program, as we're, I think, well aware of, is not exactly an NIH. It's not an R01 that you're putting together. What about those awards and how Sanofi thinks about an engagement with a successful applicant might you think be unexpected, or you've encountered that investigators didn't realize was as important to Sanofi that would make a difference for these folks to know?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer in some ways. I think if we look back, one of the advantage I have is looking at the 20-year history of Sanofi's investment in academia, particularly in the Boston area where I've been involved in most of these things. So iAward is not the only mechanism by which we fund academic research. There are traditional sponsored research programs. There are strategic programs like for Joslin Diabetes Center. It's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar investment. Because Sanofi is a diabetes company, we like to work with top diabetes centers to identify innovation and fund them. So there are different ways to fund academic research, and some of them may be still in the basic research criteria. Not all of that is very product and portfolio focused. But we're trying to reduce that part of that because that never produces any value other than individuals learning and getting to know other individuals and building relationships. It doesn't really contribute because within a pharma, if you fund something, there has to be some measurable value that we can articulate to the organization, our organization, so that they could increase this investment over time. If we cannot articulate a measurable outcome from these things, then it becomes a very difficult argument to make to the management, you should increase the investment in this, right? So in order to make a convincing argument that, this year we are investing $20 million, we want to increase it to $40 million next year, you had to show something. Right? Something that had an impact on our pipeline. So to do that, I think we have to minimize. I'm very passionate about investing in academia, but I had to control myself too, to say, in the end, the goal for the company is to bring a product to the patient. I think that's what most academic investigators we interact with want too. Right? you have a great science, you have a great idea which you believe will make a change in patients' lives someday. The time frame could be very different, but how a pharma company, whether it's Pfizer or Lilly or AbbVie, with all the expertise we have in drug development, how can we work together to make that, as quick as possible? So, as much as we like to fund all the things, I think we have to exercise some discipline. That's at least a lesson I learned, to really make these academic industry partnerships work for the future.
So we've got about 15 or so minutes left, and I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. So if anyone does have a question, just start raising your hand and I'll keep looking out. And we have one right there in the middle.
Hi, how are you? My name is Doug Rains from the Department of Anesthesia. Can you give me your perspective on drug development for orphan diseases? When you look at external projects that are focused on that, do you say, oh, this is just a small market, we're not interested? Or do you take the other side of the spectrum where you'd say, at least for now, it's a small market, but the development pathway may be inexpensive and there may be opportunities to treat other diseases?
I think we're going to reserve the company that bought Genzyme to last. Maybe, Nader, you want to address that?
So Genzyme is an important part of Sanofi, which focuses on rare disease. So we don't shy away from investing in rare disease. It's an area which, for the company from commercial sense as well, producing significant value and grows very well. So there's significant interest in funding in rare disease. But it comes down to strategy. You have 7,000 rare diseases, so you cannot go wild on these things. So you have to figure out which areas that any company wants to focus on. So Sanofi, for historical reasons, decided to invest a lot in lysosomal storage diseases, for example. Now it's slowly expanding to other areas. But I think we try to focus on things that fit with our strategy, and also, like any other indication, whether rare or not so rare diseases, it has to have a strong genetic validation or reason to invest in, and the path towards the clinic is fairly clear to us. I think it's a great time for rare disease, though, personally, with all the advancements in gene therapy and gene editing and many other things in different therapeutic modalities. Rare disease model itself and its business attraction is very good. It's a great time. We are all trying to learn there. But to answer your question simply, yes, we are interested in that.
I think perhaps a follow-on for both of you, Tony and Nader, is does the fact that the proposal coming to you involves a rare disease, and assuming that the proposal is well characterized and addresses a market that you're interested in, does that change the equation about the evaluation of the proposal at all?
So no. Not at all. So rare diseases is a strategic area of interest for Pfizer. It's been for quite a long time. I think all rare diseases are not the same. Obviously, you talk about parceling out what exactly is the patient population. There are ultra rare diseases. We have a collaboration with the National Human Genome Research Institute to understand ultra rare diseases, where there are 2 or 3 patients maybe in the world who have a disease, where rare diseases then become a window into more common disorders. So the idea is to look at rare diseases where it's genetically defined and say there's some overlay with more common disorders and say this could be a development path forward. So I think in that sense we can learn about the biology with an eye in helping those patients with the ultra-rare population as well as patients that make up a larger segment of the general population. I guess I just pull back before I answer that question. It's we have to recoup our investment that we make in drug development. So whether we're developing an asset for 3 patients in the world or for millions of patients in the world, we still have regulatory hurdles. We still have to do IND-enabling studies. We still have to have facilities to manufacture those medicines that are compliant with the regulatory agencies across the world. We still have to have regulatory studies that define safety and define efficacy. And the agency has some leniency for rare diseases. There may be some tax incentives in the orphan drug tax credit, but there's still a lot of investment that has to happen. So our eye is to always help patients, but we always have to think about how do we recoup that investment? And when we have a manufacturing facility, if we're trying to make a medication that may cost millions of dollars a year to just keep up the production of that medication. So what does that look like for patients then if we have only a few patients who would benefit from this? So actually at Pfizer we have a model. We actually spun out a company called SpringWorks Therapeutics. It's focused on rare diseases, and that's where we look to kind of get out of the model of just what traditional pharma does and say there's a lot of disease and patient advocacy foundations that are also investing in rare diseases like NORD, where SpringWorks, Laura Sullivan, who was on the leadership team of Pfizer R&D, again, she spun out this company. Pfizer's a minority shareholder in it, and the idea is how can we look towards philanthropic drug development in those areas where it may not necessarily be commercially viable. So not everything that we do in pharma, contrary to public opinion, is just about revenue, but we do have to maintain a positive revenue to be in business to continue to develop therapeutics for patients. So we're looking for that right mix and that right avenue and new ways of helping patients with rare diseases.
Questions? Yes, right here.
So from the outside perspective, what are some of the bigger hurdles that you face for collaborating with partners, investigators, in particular MGH investigators? What are some of the hurdles, practically speaking? Things that you shy away from that maybe you think that we could perhaps address?
Well, and Nelson told me to be honest, right? So, every institution has its own reputation about how difficult they are to work with, typically on the contractual side of things. And there we start talking about intellectual property and all that. And it's interesting. I mean, I didn't really do this as a day job until about 3 years ago. So at that time, all institutions that we were kind of dealing with said it's a new day. We're more open. We're not as we're not so tied to all this IP. And the pharma, we as AbbVie said the same thing. But when the rubber hits the road, we found it was still pretty tough. And it's just a heads up for the investigators too. This contractual piece can take. I monitor this. I put graphs on it because it's fascinating. Can take a year. Now it's gotten better. I will tell you, it's gotten significantly better at AbbVie for a lot of reasons, and I think even the external environment, the academic environment's gotten better. But I would argue that is still one of the hurdles that we have. Institutions wanting big, giant 10-year arrangements, and at least from AbbVie's standpoint, that's not what we do. And so if you go into that, and that's the kind of the bar, we start with a battle from the get-go for that. So one of the things I was chatting with Nelson, I think one of the things don't underestimate is just even small collaborations. You don't know how many doors for you that opens. We have gotten into more kind of tangent projects, if you will, from just little arrangements that we've done, and so don't shy away, I would argue, from even little things. But I still would argue that and it's not going to be MGH unique, is that whole contractual piece it unfortunately can kill the science.
I say compared to the other institutions, I think MGH is a great place to work with and relatively easy to do things. I think contract times and all of that, at least in our experience, is pretty good here. My personal peeve is always with any academic institution is not specific to MGH, is the amount of overhead we pay. So which is quite significant. But I don't think the university have much leeway in controlling that. But it takes a policy, I think, at at the very high level at different academic institutions to fix the overhead so that you could still charge pharma the same money, but most of the money we fund, we like to see that go to the investigators. But that's not a MGH specific problem.
So, Rich, I think there was someone over here.
Hi, my name is Mary Ann Sen. I'm from the Department of Dermatology, and I'm just wondering for people new to research who might not have personal connections to people in industry, what is the best way to figure out what the strategic targets might be for the various companies so that if we're using resources to try and present our ideas, we're presenting them and using our resources in the right area? And also for those of us who are involved in clinical research and starting out in that, what's the best way to make those relationships with the right people within industry for sort of translational work?
I would say, in my experience, talk to a tech transfer office because they usually have connections within the industry. So they should be able to connect at least one person or a few people they know, and from there you could go. We also, from our side, we have a whole bunch of people dedicated to scouting, talking to academic investigators full time. It's impossible for them to meet everybody. But it is a challenge, I would say. Getting to know somebody in industry and vice versa is very, very challenging. For us, if I need to find some top 10 people in neurosciences, I can get into a database search and find those people and reach out to them. It's very difficult for somebody to find top 10 people in Sanofi to reach out to. So it's still a challenging problem, but the best way is to at least initially reach out to tech transfer offices, I would say. Right, Seema?
Can I add to that? I would argue scientific meetings. You go and I don't care what level the scientist is, and get that contact information and just be persistent. And because that to me is that will get you there faster often than I think going through these other avenues. And those are the people that you're going to get excited. And that's what you need an advocate. You're going to need an internal advocate because at the end of the day, somebody's got to champion this. And that's what you need. That is my advice.
Yeah, and just to find areas of interest that companies are looking for collaborations, you can go on the websites. I mean, it sounds a little bit simple, but on most companies' websites, we do say the areas where we're actively involved, and we try to list as much detail. There's the JP Morgan conference that happens every year, generally, and it just happened a couple weeks ago. Companies update, I know we do at Pfizer, our strategic areas of interest kind of leading up to JP Morgan, because that's the big deal making generally for biotechs. But the areas we're interested in, they're written, generally explicitly stated on the website. You can also look through, companies have what's in their portfolio. Those are often meant for investors, for quarterly earnings reports, for shareholders, but you can see what's in their pipeline, what they're developing. And folks generally like to cluster around certain areas. Very rarely do you have a one-off asset. So that's another way to kind of divine the tea leaves. Another thing that I do in partnership with the TTO office here is sometimes we hold office hours where we say, hey, I'll be on campus for a day, and we talk to people, and we'll take meetings, and it can be everything under the sun that we can talk about. So that's a great way to try to get some feedback. And something that I think we're moving to is if, unfortunately we had an exit from neuroscience earlier this year. If I see an interesting project, I still say, hey, you should think about this company or this company. So we really try to give you I try to give the most feedback that I can. So, we want to find those individual collaborations that will ultimately lead to portfolio project. But as we've all said, I think we do want to develop a good relationship with the principal investigators. So sometimes, unfortunately, we do have to refer you somewhere else that may be a lead, but in the hopes that maybe this project doesn't work, but it will kind of open the channels up, and that as another project comes in from your lab or another lab, that we will have an opportunity to have that discussion.
And I will tag team on something that Tony said, that in my history, one of the effective ways at an academic meeting is you've got the poster presenter, and then you have someone else from the lab who's there as well, and that person stands in the back and just looks at the crowd that's in front of the poster. Takes a look at the name tags, starts talking to people, because the poster presenter has to be talking to people who are interested in the poster, and is a one-on-one conversation. But the person who knows from the lab is walking around the back and saying, oh, look, Sanofi was there. There are 4 people from Sanofi there. And all of a sudden you know, maybe I ought to give Sridhar a call. And it's a great way to tag team a poster and get more value as far as collaborations later out of that event. So, just thought.
I agree. I think all of these things are important. There's no single way to reach out to industry.
Yeah.
I just want to also mention about this office day. We also do that. And it's, I think, something industry should do more of. You know, we did 2 last year, one at Boston Children's and one at UPenn. That's a pretty good way to meet, you know, on any given day, 50, 60 faculty who are interested in working with our company. And we get a lot of ideas from those meetings. Because we take our top leadership to these meetings, like our therapeutic area heads were there, believe me, it's much more, at least in Sanofi, I would tell you, very hard to get academic research proposal funded compared to a biotech thing. We have a defined process to quickly make a decision on a biotech deal if we need to do it quickly, but that doesn't apply to academic collaborations. It's a long process to get academic collaborations funded, which we are trying to change, but the reality is it's a very complex bureaucracy within, at least Sanofi. I think it's generally in the industry. There's a lot more scrutiny in funding a very small amount in academic research compared to biotechs because the value chain contributions are different. Although everybody sees value in this, so getting to the right champion is probably the best way to get this thing funded. Getting to as high level as a decision-making person is even better if you could.
So let's take one more question over here.
Hi, Kendra Taylor from First Amino Consulting. Can you just speak a little bit on the importance of market research? I think that this is an area where many academic investigators often fall a little short. So can you talk about that, the importance in terms of qualitative and quantitative market research and the importance for you when receiving that information?
You know, I spent many years as a consultant. I don't think within and I had different roles within pharma. When you think about research and development, we're primarily focused on the science. The market, you know, there's the areas that we're interested in and what we'd even entertain as a project that's determined by, we think that there's a viable market space. But most of the due diligence that we do at this point is completely focused on the science. And I think, you know, one of your issue, your point about funding biotech, which is generally a lot easier in Pfizer than funding academic partnerships and a bigger share of our output of funding. You know, that does also stem from reproducibility within the literature. So, you know, we also look to repeat findings and data that we see published within the literature internally, and part of our collaborations is around reproducibility of publicly of published information, which is quite low, actually. So I think that's, you know, some of the perceived barriers in allocating funds to biotech, where we know they're probably a little bit further along, where we have a better idea of where they stand, versus an academic collaboration when we just look at reproducibility in general, it's quite low, and that becomes a barrier to, you know, kind of leadership, the leadership team designating more funding to academic collaborations.
So we're just about up, and I want to leave time for the next panel to come up, but I think what we've heard today is really that there's a great desire by many pharmaceutical companies to learn from the kind of things that we're doing within the partner members institutions, and the real key to this is understanding what's needed on the pharma side and how you can provide it on an academic side without really changing a whole lot of what you're doing, because they're interested in what you're doing. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists today for a very interesting session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. That was a great panel, and it was really interesting to hear not just the perspectives of quote-unquote industry, but then within industry that you see that there are different ways of thinking about academic research and these interactions. So thank you again. Next, I'm going to introduce Emmy Chen. Emmy is one of the leaders in our licensing organization within Partners Innovation. And Emmy has been with Partners about a dozen years, so really has been in this role for quite a while and has seen a lot of things. I think she's probably been here about half the time that Partners has been in existence as an organization. So, and here we're going to switch gears and really focus on the same topic, but looking at it from the other side, from the investigator side. So, Emmy, if you would want to introduce your panel, that'd be great.
So as Roger said, I think what we want to do with this panel is really give tips that address, I think, some of what was mentioned in our prior panel, where we get the perspectives from our investigators here who have been through the process, have interacted with industry, have ongoing collaborations with multiple companies, and hopefully we'll be able to share some of their perspectives based on their experiences to date. So I'm going to introduce our panelists before we get into the content. So first we have Susan Kopman, who is an assistant professor of neurology at MGH. Her lab works on a group of rare childhood onset inherited disorders known as NCL or Batten disease. And they are guided by an in-depth understanding of human disease genetics. And her lab carries out both basic and early-stage drug discovery research, which involves identification of candidate drug targets and preclinical proof of concept testing. Some of the companies that she's working with are Biogen, Bluebird Bio, and Sanofi. Next, we have Connor Evans, who is an assistant professor of dermatology at MGH. Dr. Evans's research is focused on problem-driven development, application, and clinical translation of optical and imaging tools. And some of the companies that he works with are Johnson & Johnson, Biopharma X, Leo Pharma, Becton Dickinson, and Estee Lauder. And finally, we have Alan Mullen, who is an assistant professor of medicine at MGH. Dr. Mullen's lab is interested in understanding how to modulate hepatic stellate cells to develop treatments for liver fibrosis. And some of the companies that he works with are Boehringer Ingelheim, Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and Bristol Myers Squibb. So what I thought we would maybe do to start is have each of our panelists talk about maybe an example of a company that they're working with. And I think in line with some of the questions that were raised in our prior panel, talk a little bit about how did you get started working with industry? How did you make the contact with this particular industry that you're collaborating with? And maybe part of that would be talking about, did that company approach you or did you approach them? How did that relationship get started? And if you could also maybe touch on the question of how did you identify the right contact at the company? I think that would be helpful for us to hear. So maybe we'll start with Sue.
So the first answer is that I actually have one of the Sanofi Eye Awards. So this was one of the sort of best examples of, and following on from the first panel, of the way that I got connected with one of the companies that I've been working with. So it was really a proposal submitted in response to the call for proposals. And I actually tried 2 years or two calls in a row. The first time was not selected for funding, and the second time was selected for funding. So persistence definitely pays off. And additional examples with other companies, it's really been through networking and identifying people inside the company that typically, in my case, it has been that I've been approached actually by the people in the company because of the particular disease area that I work in and being known in the community.
So in my case, I've also been approached by most of the companies that I work with. And those have been in response to either conference talks that I potentially give, or we've been very fortunate to have situations where we've had very well-received press releases, newspaper articles, Scientific American articles, CBS News, clips that have been about our research, and from that we've been able to leverage those press opportunities to have companies approach us directly and want to get involved. Part of the benefit that I have in my research is that I'm at the Wellman Center for Photomedicine, which is very much a problem-driven research organization. So rather than working on an organ or a disease type, we tend to focus on clinical problems, which means from the outset we are involved in stakeholders, talking to individuals, trying to figure out where the gaps are. And in my lab, we develop technology and platforms that aim to address specific problems. And that has a really unique way of attracting certain attention, because someone in pharma or someone in a drug company or a cosmetic company will say, hey, that's something I want to work on, or that's a problem I've been having, and I just heard one of Connor's people give a talk at a conference. And so that's how we've made those connections. There have been times where I've actually openly pursued companies where I thought there were opportunities. So, for example, we have now an ongoing collaboration with Leo Pharma. We had been developing tools to do topical skin pharmacokinetic studies, and I had the opportunity to meet someone from the company and kind of reached out to them directly and said, hey, I think you'd be interested in this area. And that started a collaboration that we now have. So it's been a combination of both being approached and approaching others, but persistence has always paid off.
Right. From my side, I think I've benefited a lot by being part of larger networks of groups of researchers who work on similar areas. So, for example, we work on fibrosis, and we're part of the Harvard Fibrosis Network, which involves both people working on renal fibrosis, pulmonary fibrosis, cardiac fibrosis, as well as liver fibrosis. And by joining those groups, then that makes us a little bit more noticeable to industry when they've been interested in the problems of fibrosis, which has really gained interest a lot in the last year or so, or last really 2 or 3 years. And so if someone will approach one of the investigators there, that's how one of these grants got started. They approached one of the investigators, but we're interested in a much broader program, and they could say immediately, oh, we can look at all these different tissues and all these different organ systems. Why don't we get together we'll bring the rest of the group in, and we'll talk to you about those type of projects. And that has certainly helped with a number of the different projects we've been working on. The other thing has been through meetings. Some people will be interested in the topic, and then the group comes up, and then they're aware of our work from meetings where a number of members of those different companies have seen the posters or seen us talk. And that again increased interest as well in those areas, and knowing, again, that we're part of a larger group that's doing multiple things can really help as well. I think the other way I've benefited is just keep in touch with people who are at MGH who've left. We have, for good or bad, we have a lot of turnover here, and a lot more than I realized as I was coming in as a resident, then a fellow, then into more science. But a lot of people head off to do other things, and so keeping in touch with those people who end up in industry, who have a little bit of idea of those areas of we're working on, has also been a very good way to kind of to find someone to talk to about different areas where we have an interest, where we think they may be a joint interest as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually just had one thing to add. The topic of rare disease was brought up earlier. I work on a rare disease, and I'm actually extremely active in the patient advocacy and foundation community, and I go to a lot of family conferences and really interact heavily within the community, within the research community. And I think this makes an enormous difference because your name gets out there, and they are who companies often will call first, the patient advocacy community, to say who within the field should I talk to about this particular problem that I want to get information on. So I think this is really important for the rare disease area.
So I guess once contacts are made, I think maybe what would be helpful for people to hear about is, okay, we've identified, a company, we're talking with them, they're interested. Now we need to figure out what the project is, what the scope of the funding will be. Can each of you maybe talk a little bit about what that process is like? I mean, there's a little bit of a pitch element to that. You hook them in terms of your expertise, perhaps. But then to kind of get the correct budget that will achieve something, mutually beneficial for the company and for your lab. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that process? Maybe for the iAwards, I think that's a fixed amount, but I don't know if, for your other relationships, can you maybe give us a little flavor of how that works? Do you want to start, Sue?
Sure. So I'm thinking about a particular example. So, I mean, in the case of the I award, first maybe I'll address the question a little bit with that. It is a fixed budget, but I think it was really important to demonstrate that we had the tools necessary to test what we said we wanted to test, the assays, the model systems in hand already being carried out. And so it speaks to this question about how ready to go, like how achievable was the work that we said we wanted to do. I also think positioning it as this is an important topic for a rare disease, but it actually has can be leveraged to have applicability to other more common disease, was important to make sure that was clear in the way that the proposal was written. In terms of some of the other projects, not related to the I award, but the other projects, it really was a particular candidate treatment. We had all of the tools and assays, the model systems, and so it was really developing a project in collaboration with the internal champion at the company, and really developing. I think it's really important to have a very realistic budget, actually, so not being afraid to ask for what you really actually do need to cover what you need to do for the project is important. And then, I think there were conversations earlier about flexibility and having the flexibility to change direction during the project. I think those are all really important aspects, and I think staying open to all of that has been extremely important and has really helped keep the projects going and successful.
So in the projects I've been involved in, people who know me know I'm very forthright. I'll just kind of spit out what I want to say. And so I've kind of tested the waters very early on because the programs I've been involved in, the collaborations that have worked really well are like what was said earlier, when there's a lot of open communication and when they're true collaborations. They're not a company gives X dollars and say, we'll see you in a year, because those deviate very quickly from how they're supposed to go, and there's a lot of miscommunication. So I've come right out and said, what kind of scope are you thinking of? How far do you want to go? What does your timeline look like? And they aren't 5-year projects. They're usually 2 or 3 year long, 3 if you're very lucky. And up front, I've always tried to get an estimate of what are your cost structure? What are you looking at? And there's been a lot of projects that have died, or interesting ideas that died right on the vine, because they come out and say, well, we're thinking about $30,000. And it's like, that's not going to cover the overhead. And then I've had the opposite problem where early on I would lowball my own budgets just because I really wanted that contract. And then you're in the middle of it and you're saying, I really needed those extra supply dollars. So it's been a process of going back and forth. But these days, and having done this for a couple of years, it's more of at the outset being very open, very transparent. These are my budget requirements. This is what I need to do. Are you okay with that? And is this going to be a collaboration that's going to work? And to some of the points opened earlier, I openly ask, as part of the conversation, what the company is bringing. Is it statistical know-how? Is it big data? Is it data science? Is it analysis? And every company brings a different piece. And knowing those people on the other side and where those connections are going to go are critical for setting up the milestones. And the budget follows the milestones. So I think having that very open discussion, kind of once the pleasantries are over and you're really excited about the science, has been really important to us, having successful early budgets and then successful projects that kick off from that.
I think a lot of this is just staying in touch and communicating with people, and it's very different than writing a grant that you send off, someone reviews it, and you get an answer. Most of the programs that we've set up have really developed over the course of 1.5 to 2 years before things are actually signed. So there are a lot of, when we meet, we talk about what people's interests are, what our expertise is, what we think we really want to do, how that fits with what they're interested in. And over time, the project has changed during that course of those negotiations. Sometimes we go back, discuss things multiple times, go back and represent with different groups. to really get a sense of what we can do, what we were interested in, and what's really beneficial to the company as well. And then in each of these projects, we've also set up, it's not just, again, that they're giving us the money, it's usually a collaboration. We meet regularly either by Skype if they're in Germany, or we meet by some type of communication on a regular basis to really discuss how the project's going. I think a lot of that really, that collaboration and getting to know people is very important over that time, and just understanding that if things go slowly, a lot of it's, again, around negotiation with the contract, and it's not oftentimes a lack of interest on the science part, but just keeping in touch and kind of allowing that process to work out, but keeping everyone engaged during that.
So would each of you say that as you went through this process, I mean, it sounds like because it was a collaborative discussion to develop where the final proposal was, you wouldn't say that you went into the start of these discussions really having a set proposal that you're really tailoring it towards the discussion with the company. I think that's what I'm hearing, and that it will evolve along the way.
I think it varies some. I've gone in and just presented this is what we were very interested in, because they knew that was the area that we were working on. And then it evolves into a discussion as to what they're interested in and why they're interested in what we're working on and what they actually want to do with that. I've had another company we're talking to right now, Roy, said, we have a technology that we're really interested in applying to this area that you're working in. How can we do this and do it in a way that's interesting to both of us? And then we, again, brainstorm and come up with ways that we think that we can apply what we're using and what's interesting to them.
It's really rare in all the times I've been involved that what I've written initially is what we end up doing. And it's actually kind of fun, right? So you kind of put down your dream, right? Your dream project. And of course it has to be these are not grant applications, right? These are like 3-page, 4-page with some milestones. And they're kind of skeletons that you fill in as you go. And I think one of the things that we as investigators, when we work with industry, have to do is kind of take our egos and put them away for a little while and say, okay, what I'm really passionate about, you may not be passionate about, the industry may not be passionate about. Really, what's your problem? What are you interested in? And there's been a lot of learning that I've done in all my company interactions. And I have to say that at the end of the day, the projects that we've come up with have been more interesting than what I submitted initially, partially because I've really learned about what the company is interested in and where they want to go. So that flexibility is tantamount. I think that word is really important. And in setting up the project and then in executing it, because you're going to find new things and there's going to be changes to the company and there's going to be a need to not necessarily stay fixed to that research contract, but to be able and willing to innovate.
I was also just going to make a point about, it's probably true for all three of us. I've had experience where I've been trying to develop a proposal with a company and it definitely falls apart too. It falls apart and doesn't actually turn into something. And I think making sure that you really are also getting something out of the collaboration is really important. And don't be afraid to end up turning away the relationship and walking away. I think the Partners Innovation Office does a really good job of helping with that. But I also think from the scientific point of view, if it really isn't something that's helpful for your research program, I think it's important to be able to also say, this is just not going to work out, because sometimes it just doesn't. So flexibility, from 2 points of view, I think is very important.
So I think in terms of the existing industry collaborations, I think a number of the ones that we have here at the institution and that our panelists are involved in often are with an entity, but it's multiple projects with that entity. So I was wondering if those of you who are involved in those types of collaborations could talk a little bit about that process of being maybe one project out of many with a company and sort of what that's like to sort of coordinate, I guess, with your colleagues here. And because I imagine that would be maybe a little bit of a different type of a pitch to a company, and how does something like that come together?
So I had a very interesting collaboration that was actually myself and David Fisher with Johnson & Johnson, and our two components weren't siloed. They had some interaction between them, and so his lab at his program, ours lab at our program. And initially, we set out to kind of do them independently, but have crosstalk. And that consortium project changed very quickly because it turned out we really needed each other. And so, though, if you looked at the contract, it really didn't show that we were going to have all these interactions. We ended up building a lot of bridges and helping each other. We made nanoparticles for David's lab, and they helped us with mass spec and cytometry. And so, it turned out actually to build a really strong relationship. And I guess initially I wasn't sure that was going to be a good thing. But you kind of go into a collaboration or to one of these and say, okay, there's more people on this relationship, but they're going to do their part and we're going to do their part and we're going to stay separate. And in not every case, it's advisable to form those bridges and to help each other out. But at least in my experience, that was a great opportunity, cemented a really solid collaboration that we've carried on to the future, and actually ended up answering more questions for the company than we ever thought we would. So I guess it has to do on a case-by-case basis, but if it makes sense to break down those walls and not stay siloed, absolutely go for it.
So we really push that as one of the benefits of working with the group is that we have multiple investigators all interested in fibrosis and different aspects of that who meet regularly and are collaborating with each other outside of that and can demonstrate that we're actually publishing together. All those things I think is a big plus when they're looking potentially at larger areas. They want to make sure they're not just funding individual groups of people who aren't even communicating with each other, but being able to even emphasize that whatever we find here, we can share with our colleagues we meet with regularly, and all those things can be kind of shared back and forth. And I think both in terms of the ideas of what can be accomplished and actually what we can accomplish does really increase with that collaboration too. So we in general will emphasize that too.
And I think also going back to the idea of having a connection to the patient advocacy community and the patient community and the clinicians at this institution in particular, I think leveraging those aspects about being at partners is really important, and making sure that you really maintain connections with, if you're a basic researcher, that you're thinking about, well, the end goal is a drug that's going to treat patients. So really interacting with clinicians is really, really important. And this has always been, I think, one of the areas that MGH has excelled at, particularly in the rare disease area that I work in. And it's one of the reasons we have been sought out by companies, because we had both the basic research element being quite strong, and in addition, the clinical element being quite strong in the connection to patient samples and the patient community.
So before I guess I start opening it up for questions from our audience, I think maybe the last question I wanted to ask was just sort of what would, in terms of like, we're in an academic environment, and I think everybody who comes here is trained, I think, through their postdoc or through their graduate school work to write NIH grants, and I think it's a very different mindset, and all of a sudden having to switch to think about getting industry funding. I think it's a very different mindset, and as some of the comments you've already reflected that, even the scopes of the projects are very different. So I was wondering if you could each just maybe provide some comments on sort of how do you parse out those types of projects? I don't know if it's for you in your labs, it's like a continuum of, we start projects with one type of funding, and then we kind of consider industry when we get to a stage where NIH can no longer fund it, or are there just more translational projects that those are the ones that you kind of silo off, and that's more what you pitch to industry. So I'm just sort of curious how you guys kind of focus your efforts in terms of industry versus NIH, and if you could each speak to that.
So I think we do both work in stem cell, ESL, embryonic stem cell development, and fibrosis. And one of the reasons I switched to fibrosis was it was actually much more clinically relevant. We can do a lot of the same experiments. One of the interests of our lab is long non-coding RNAs and how those regulate development. But we can use that as a platform to study a lot of these non-coding RNAs and fibrosis, and all the techniques we developed there have been really applicable to fibrosis. And so I've learned more that I can actually do a lot of the experiments we're very interested in doing in fibrosis, because those are of more interest to pharma, because it actually is more directly applicable. And so I think I'm always thinking about how we can do experiments there that will inform us back on the other model system we're working in, and how we can use those to do a little bit more basic stuff that we're also very interested in. So I think a lot of these agreements have been based around things that I think we're very interested in doing, but we're interested in doing them because we actually want to get beyond to a little bit more mechanism. And that's the way I think most of these projects have worked in our lab.
So I would say 90% of all the projects that have gone off to do work with a company have started from some kind of seedling grant. At least the industry partners we work with in the platform technology area, I kind of have to have a platform first. I have to have something that I can demonstrate is going to be the foundation of what we're going to bring. And we haven't had a single collaboration with industry where we haven't had that key demo, which is, hey, come in my lab, put your hands on this, this is how it works. This is why it's going to work well in this context. And so we've had to leverage a lot of sources of seedling money. So in some cases, it's an NIH grant, it's an ARC-21. Thanks to an absolutely brilliant lady I work with at the Wellman Center, Lynn Drake, we have DoD funding that helps support seedling money. And those are the key, right? That crystallizes the idea, gets us just far enough, and then a company now starts taking interest because we have something to go with. So I think that translational platform of small seedling grant and then moving it towards clinical translation because we're interested in that clinical problem is a really important thing. One thing you had mentioned, and I just take a quick moment on to say, is making that transition is not hard if you've done it a couple times. And the first time you've done it, it's actually, I think it's pretty hard because you're still thinking, oh, I got to write a 12-page grant, and I need to have my specific aims page, and it's not at all like that when you work with industry. So I think it's beholden on those of us who have made those transitions to really make it an active part of our training. I benefited from my graduate studies and my postdoctoral studies from having mentors who were very active in industry collaborations, and so I got it all. I had templates already on my computer that I knew how to bring forward, even if they were badly misplaced in the first couple years. And I think it's something that we all have to do as PIs and as mentors, is to ensure that our students and our postdocs see how that transition works and can bring it forward in their own research in the future. So this doesn't come from nowhere. The knowledge has to be passed down.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely been a learning process for me. I would say, I've muddled my way through, and I would by no means call myself an expert at interactions with industry. I'm really still learning, and I think, taking that, actually I get a lot of value from that, because I also think it cross-fertilizes, and my other more academic discovery research actually benefits from that as well, because you learn how to really ask specific questions better. You learn to let go of things a little bit better. So I think it's really valuable, actually. I forgot what my other thought was. I had one other thought. I actually forgot what it was. But yeah, I think these interactions just have been great for moving things from basic to translational. That's actually the point that I was going to make, was that you asked specifically about, do you really kind of move the things that are more translational to these industry-sponsored projects, and then keep the more basic things really for your NIH and foundation-sponsored things. That is the way that we generally do it. That's the way it's worked out. And I agree that the seed money to develop the projects that you then try and get industry interest in is really, really critical from foundations or from NIH grants.
So I guess we'll start taking questions. If anyone has follow-up questions to what we've discussed already, we're happy to have our panelists address those now. We've thoroughly answered all the questions.
Maybe sorry.
Sure.
One question.
One question in terms of, and you referred to this early on, in you're making a decision about which direction to go in your research. That's a major decision to make it more translational. I'm interested to know how you make the minor decisions in a particular path within a direction. Now, in fibrosis, for example, thinking that this is something that I suspect I could get funded in industry more than I can get an R01 around or any other kind of federal funding. How do you go about making that kind of decision process in your own work going forward?
Depends on the system we're working in, and we're interested in long non-coding RNAs, again, as I mentioned, as a regulator of fibrosis. And so those, I think, trying to do the very basic experiments, those have to be more NIH-related funding. And we think about trying to understand how to apply those more to disease, which I think become much more translate in those translation areas. And so that's usually the direction things get split. We also do a lot of screening for drug compounds or genes that regulate fibrosis by a number of different high-throughput assays. And in many ways, those are more interested to pharma, but what the benefit for us is we start understanding what those are and start trying to look at the mechanisms, and then those I would anticipate, as we can explore those a little bit more, we start going back and writing, as we've done with one of these already, more NIH-type grants to look at the mechanism of those pathways.
So I may just be a glutton for punishment, but I pursue all paths at the same time. So, a good example is we had, I have been trying for like 15 years to convince somebody to fund a program to develop a certain type of portable microscope that we can bring in and do very special type of clinical studies that would, power mostly pharmacokinetics in the clinic and people in real time. And so, I've been banging on doors for years on this, and we recently had success both through an NIH grant as well as through a company, almost around the same time. Now, they're focused on different places, and that was, you have to be careful when you do that you make sure that you have your pie slices cut up well. But, I would say if you're real passionate about something and you really want to go in a certain direction, knock on every door you can, and if you have simultaneous successes, so be it. But be careful there's no scientific overlap, because that would just be awful.
I think for me, some of the decision making has actually come from the networking and the timing, the presentations at conferences, and then finding a common interest with another academic lab or with a company. And it sometimes is actually organically driven from those interactions where the decision goes on what you pursue first. And then along the way, the things that you learn as you're doing that can actually benefit some of the things that maybe, that you've been really passionate about but haven't been able to convince somebody of for such a long time. And then those ultimately really get pushed forward as well. So I think again, it goes back to the importance of attending meetings, networking with people, connecting to people who are champions inside of companies, and maintaining those long-term relationships, because those are actually really critical as well. The other thing that I was going to mention is to maintain relationships with your trainees as well, because in fact, some of the projects that have been carried forward from in my lab that have been an interaction with a sponsored agreement with a company have actually been really championed by former trainees of mine once they've moved on. And so again, staying connected to people that have been at MGH and knew about the work that you were doing, really maintaining that network is really important.
I'll maybe add one thing onto it, which is, so making those minor decisions, none of us have a crystal ball, right? We're not sure when things are going to happen. And I've looked in the mirror many times and said, do you really know what you're doing? Are you really making the right choices? And I think this is one of these situations where I have found it tremendously useful to use the resources that are available at MGH. At our center, we have a translational core program where we actually have someone who has experience in industry and in academia, who I have built my research programs up with and really talked to in detail about how to make those calls and those decisions. I've gone to innovations. I was on the phone with Emmy in my first couple of years here many times saying, what's your feeling? How do you think you should go? And really just farming out questions on where to go from people who, my directors, my department chairs, if I could find them. And you know, I think those were immensely important because in half the time I found someone, they said, it's a great question. I had to do that 10 years ago and I made the wrong choice. Don't do it, do this one. And they've saved me a lot of hassle in making the wrong calls. So, you know, I certainly as a young PI starting off, I absolutely wasn't sure which way to go. As someone who has been around for a couple of years, I probably still don't know which way to go all the time. And so you just go to your stakeholders, your mentors, and all resources you can find and ask questions. And that just helps inform you every step of the way.
Hi, so thank you for all this information. I have a sort of a more practical question. So sometimes the interaction with industry has a lot of rules, like certain people cannot know what other people in the lab are doing, or any equipment bought by from company money cannot be used for anything else, or you cannot publish for 2 years. So I don't know if you have any advice on how to deal with this kind of restrictions, which are never part of grants.
So let me kick the first part. So when it comes to knowledge and confidentiality, the way I would recommend doing it is to silo by personnel. So in my team, we're working with 2 pharma companies that have both given us top secret compounds, and one person in each team, one person in my team knows one company's and one person knows the other. We have code names for them, and that's it. And so it's not shared across. We share the knowledge products, we share the outcomes and code and help each other build stuff, but we keep that knowledge very clear, and we silo that by personnel, and that has been extremely, extremely helpful. I'm the only person who knows all the information, and we all keep separate notebooks to make sure that they're separate. So there has to be a real clear separation when you're doing those kind of things. Something that worried me at the end, which you said was you can't publish for 2 years. Maybe I'm picky. I've never entered an agreement where I've had one of those. I think in innovations, actually, to their credit, has stopped me from entering an agreement where I had one of those kind of conditions. What I've been very forceful on doing, if a company says, I have these drugs that I want you to evaluate, or I want you to look at, or I want to use your tools, but you can't publish on these, I say, great, you're giving me 3? Give me 3 I can work on. And so I build the tool and I do the evaluations and we budget double the work. But at the end of the day, I got 3 things I can publish on. So the company keeps those parts, and maybe I'll write a paper with them later. But I think there has to be an immediate academic output that you can go to without having your hands tied behind your back. I feel like it's completely against the academic ethos to not be able to share our work publicly. And I would run away screaming from any company that try to tie your hand like that.
And with some of the agreements agreed to very short term, because I know that they need to, oftentimes there's an issue around IP. And if you think about how long it takes a paper to get published, if we have a 6-month delay while we're working something out, that's usually not going to, in my vision, slow down our ability to send a manuscript in, because we know 6 months before that submission what experiments need to be done, what's left to do, but we know the basic outline of the story enough to start doing some of those projects. So we've worked that out with some of the agreements. The other things is if we're looking at multiple different targets, the agreements allow us to proceed at our choice on some of those, and they have the right to delay a couple of them, but giving us the priority to choose those. So again, in each agreement, publication is part of that. It's understood it's what's going to happen, but we have, in some cases, again, agreed to much shorter, just sort of delays on those things.
And I think just working with Partners Innovation, because the Innovation Office is enormously helpful on this and protecting us and making sure that you understand what the restrictions are, and making sure that the things that you need to succeed as an academic lab are in place.
Right, and I'll just maybe comment on that too. So part of our role for those who haven't interacted with our office before, is to be a bridge between our investigators and their interactions with industry, including receipt of industry funding and what the conditions or obligations would be for that relationship. So, as Roger said, everything that we still do in his opening comments, it's still all mission driven, and we want for there to be an output for our researchers for their publication needs. We are trying to preserve all of the academic freedoms that our investigators need for their careers. And so any agreement that we enter into, we're going to be reviewing all of these kinds of things very closely and working and consulting with the investigators to make sure that it's an optimal deal with terms that work for both sides. So I think we're right at about time. So I want to thank our panelists for providing a lot of valuable insights to us today. Hopefully it's been helpful to hear some actual stories about interacting with industry, and it's given some helpful tips to you all. I think our panelists are going to hang out for a little bit longer if you have further questions. So thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you for that update. Just a couple of quick updates before we go. There is a reception outside, so there'll be time for everybody to stay and mingle a little bit. Our last session of this series is a area that's close to my heart, which is venture capital. So right at the end of next month, we'll have a series to talk about venture capital and how to raise money. And then one other quick thing to note is we do have our World Medical Innovation Forum coming up. It's coming closer and closer. And as you know, it's year by year, it's a different theme. And this year, the theme is artificial intelligence. So we'd love to see a lot of people there. So thank you very much. And the reception's right outside.